We're live. So, welcome to the first episode of the Average Citizen podcast. My name is Tim Dowling. I'm joined with my co-host.
Hi, Tom Creighton.
Tom Creighton.
Good evening.
Tom, what's that?
I said good evening
Good
to
evening.
The world.
Yeah, or good morning, good afternoon, and good night to shout out our alma mater. Tom and I have been friends since freshman year of college at Wazoo. I majored in public relations, started thinking about politics around that time, sociology and all the brainwashing of the liberal academia, but really just more life experience and meeting people from different backgrounds, I think, got me thinking about the world. So anyone who knows me has known I have an opinion on politics, and I try to keep it fairly reasonable. Tom and I have always had great conversations about politics and culture. We don't always see eye to eye necessarily. And I think we even probably just view the same issue from just kind of not opposite spectrums, but just different spectrums in a way. I don't know if you want to speak to that at all.
Sure. Yeah. I second what you said about we both we met each other in college, and immediately just both of us demonstrated that we have an interest in engaging on issues beyond just superficial, like we'll talk about sports, but we've always been interested in more than that. And I think, and I don't know if you were planning to talk to the audience about this, that our motivation for doing this podcast was to model and demonstrate how, like, two people that want to try and represent themselves as thoughtfully as possible should have a discussion. And to your point, you and I, like, if you were to poll us on 100 issues, we're not going to agree on all 100 issues, but we'll agree on plenty. For sure, we'll agree on plenty. We'll disagree on plenty. But then also there's that middle ground I think you were hitting on, where it's like, we don't necessarily disagree, but our bias might just, like, I might be more focused on a particular facet of an issue than you're focused on.
Yeah.
So we like synthesize each other's thoughts about the issue that way.
Yeah. I credit you in really helping me understand my own opinion better, and just making me think more critically about my own opinion. I think a lot of politics is just kind of gut instinct, and there's a lot of, the sports team's attitude, and also just, it gets caught up in just kind of white and black and you versus us or whatever. And there's just so much nuance there. And even though we're both, a couple of white guys with similar backgrounds, our lived experiences are totally different. The way we view issues is totally different. Like you said, you may get caught up or focus on one issue or aspect of an issue a little bit more than I do, and I didn't see it that way. And so just our conversations have really helped us flesh out our own ideas. And so that's kind of what the inspiration for the podcast was, especially nowadays. Everything is politicized. I think I was probably one of the first who really started to change the way I used Facebook. I just started spamming like Huffington Post articles, and I was reading Bernie Sanders in like 2014 and was just like, wow, I think this guy's onto something, and totally just started politicizing my Facebook before Facebook was all that politicized. But if you go there now, it's a cyber warfare battleground. It's almost exclusively politics and dunking and memes in one sense or another. There's some personal stuff, of course, but the fact of the matter is there's no going back to a politically apathetic America. That is just not. We simply can't go back to an apathetic America because the challenges we face are too great. And so, not that we have all the answers or that we're, perfect people or anything like that, but we do have some good conversations that we think are worth, at least sharing and chatting about. And we at least like doing it. So why not record it and put it out there?
Let's model how to have a good discussion. So what are we talking about here today,
Well,
Tim?
we kind of have to start with what I was just leading into is how did we get here as far as like this team sports mentality to politics. And so we want to do these podcasts about bigger concepts. So today's concept is about social media. Not just maybe how politically like it influences our discourse, but also just like overall effect on our health, our society, what it's doing. And so we're not really going to necessarily cover like daily news. We're both a little too busy for that. We'll interject and talk about big news stories as necessary, but we'll probably do these once a month, give us plenty of time to digest and prepare. But that can change. But anyhow, for today, we're going to talk about social media. And so I did a lot of research, and something that, this goes way before Facebook. I think the politicizing of our discourse, the polarization, the seeds of polarization, I think they go back a long time. And if you listen to, Tom Hartman, I know has mentioned this, probably Tom Hartman's a liberal talk radio. I'll shout him out. You can listen on 91.3 in Tacoma. I should probably know the name of the station, but Tom Hartman is someone that has shouted out the fairness doctrine. So the fairness doctrine was a piece of legislation introduced after World War II. 1949 is the actual date. And it required the holders of broadcast licenses to present controversial issues of politics and public importance in a manner that was honest, equitable, and balanced. In a fair and balanced way. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
So basically, broadcasters were required to not just put their one side and have an editorial or opinion piece, but actually just present both sides of the facts. I mean, it's so straightforward. Unfortunately, they kind of eroded, and in 1987, it was eliminated. And so since 1987, I think you can see through cable television and cable news in particular, how they've increasingly become less and less news and just more and more entertainment. And this just goes right into social media, I think. So
Tim,
yeah,
I think we can maybe spend a few minutes on that fairness doctrine and talk about the context of the time that it was designed and then eventually dissolved, and then how that might relate to today. That might be a good starting point, because I think
we can try.
Yeah, I think it makes sense that has played a role. So one thing that comes to mind is that might be a very narrow definition when you talk about broadcast. So, like, for example, maybe this, does cable news qualify, or like would it have qualified if the fairness doctrine was still in existence?
Televisions were not really, they were.
Well, original television was broadcast television, right? It was a public signal television broadcast, just the same way that radio was public frequency. But broadband cable is not the same scope, right? It's a bit more private enterprise to the notion of cable broadband television.
That's a good distinction.
I'm curious, like I recall, and this is where we're trying to model how to average citizens might talk about something without necessarily being experts on the subject. Like, I would be curious.
Hence the name, folks, average citizen.
I would be curious to know, like, would the cable news networks, as an example, in their current manifestations, necessarily even be covered by the fairness doctrine? I know you and I were discussing offline, Tim, like Andrew Yang the other day was talking about the fairness doctrine. And everybody today, all the pundits today, want to talk about Fox News. And like Fox News should be held to these certain standards, or they shouldn't be allowed to like say the things that they say. And there's a huge conversation to be had about that. But with respects to the fairness doctrine, like I would be curious to know, would they even be held to the fairness doctrine, or would we have to make a new law? What do you think?
We would have to apply it. I mean, the spirit of the law would have to hold and therefore encompass the CNN, Fox, the news cables, regardless of not if they're like public television. Because I think what your point is, and what was probably the case in 1949 when they originally made fairness, is that the only television channels that you had were public broadcast. Where today most channels are not like, right, it's just like PBS or your local channel would probably be considered the public broadcast. And now NBC, ABC, CBS are all privatized. Fox is all privatized. So your distinction is that we would have to update the legislation. We'd have to have a 2020 version of the fairness doctrine to encompass just like news channels, I suppose, or news, entertainment.
Yeah, you would likely have to have some sort of government classification, and it would classify an organization, right, as like, this is the purpose of this organization. And there are legitimate discussion points there, because people, I think, rightly express the concern about like the relationship between government and news organizations, right? Because there's concern about like the separation of state, and like the journalists are supposed to be the fourth branch of government, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of discussion to be had there. But yeah, I think this type of topic we
kind of started upstream in a way.
Yeah.
Because it really, the fourth branch of government is the media, and it's a delicate balance. I mean, you're going to have pros and cons, whether it's something like, two examples, the BBC in the UK is generally looked upon favorably as a pretty objective, good news source. But I'm sure UK residents have their own opinions and complaints about it. There's no perfect answer. And then of course you have the totally controlled media of like China or Russia, and so the US is an example of basically completely free enterprise, and it hasn't been too bad, but it's basically completely unregulated at this point, especially now that we've moved into the internet age.
So I think a segue to talk about social media, unless I'm interrupting like a flow that you want to take us down, but I think a segue into social media is the notion of the profit incentive for news,
right?
And how we understand that the profit incentive is to get the most clicks, the most views, get the most people to turn back in on a consistent basis. And that one of the commonly held understandings about the media ecosystem now is that the rise of social media, which I think we're going to talk about, there's some addictive components of it. It's changed the way that people interact with information, is made the mainstream media have to try to compete with that, which has made them sensationalize and compete for those clicks because it's all profit driven. And as much as I'm a capitalist, I'm super sensitive to the idea of information integrity in journalism and news reporting should, as best as we can, be insulated from this incentive structure to only focus on sensationalism and not just report the news.
Yeah, so it's it's one of those sectors of capitalism where the profit motive is hurtful, really, because they want to make advertising dollars. So how do we? What was the term you used? Like protect that? How do you protect journalism from the profit motive, or incubate it, or whatever word you used was good? Insulate it.
Yeah.
It's essentially it's public dollars and it has public funding, and that means the people are taxed to pay for it in some sense.
Yep.
Yeah, I think another distinction I want to make, because I think a lot of times in politics, we're always pointing the finger. This happens on the left and the right, is whoever's in charge is, whether it's big business, whether it's a politician, they are doing this and it's making us do something. There's like a victimization. Okay. I will say that these tendencies to why does sex sell? Why does violence sell? Why does this polarization in sports and all of that? It activates something that's latent within us. Humans are already, our minds are already wired for dopamine, whether it's positive or negative. So it's not like the news media has this conspiracy, or even social media necessarily has a conspiracy beyond making advertising dollars to divide us necessarily. I don't think the intent, I mean, there are some, we'll get some into that. There definitely are some nefarious actors who are exploiting that. But I do, as much as I like look at politics, and as much as I'm a leftist and I'm wearing the Bernie shirt and everything, it's important to like maintain your own personal accountability and understand that ultimately people do have the choice to click or to not click. It might be harder or whatnot, but I don't know, maybe I'm getting a little too Marianne Williamson on this, and this whole like, it's your choice, like peace and love. Like,
no, I think that's a good point. We should, I don't know if it's maybe one of the themes of our show or whatever, but you have to at least orient from the perspective of, personal responsibility, and the individuals have agency in this society. And I'm sure that's probably something that we're going to keep talking about, because if you're talking about politics, you're often talking about what is the relationship between the nation state and the individual, and how much agency does the nation state have, and how much sovereignty do they have versus how much agency and sovereignty does the individual have.
Yeah.
I think that's not a missing point here at all. So yes, individuals have the choice to choose to tune out the news or be more responsible with the information that they have, but the structure is also conducive to a lot of these problems that we're talking about here.
They're exploiting our minds in a way for profit, and it might not be that intentional, but then I think we'll get to the point that it's starting to become that way from certain groups. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if maybe we should play one of these clips real quick. I'm going to share this real quick. Let's see how long this clip is. But my idea, and we won't listen to the whole thing because it's 4 minutes, but I'm going to share the idea again. We're doing this kind of a pilot episode. We don't really want us to just be two talking heads, and it's just our opinions. We'll go back and forth. I don't know how much fun that is, but we really want to include more other content. I think we want to include as many other voices as possible. So not only we'll be referencing some of these clips or homework that we have done in the episode itself, but I also want to link this stuff in my blog or via the social media post or something as well. So you, the participant or the listener, can have your own opinion. That's the point. Have your own opinion, understand why you have that opinion, but at least let's have some kind of real content to debate or to share. Let's see. Screen share sound. Yep.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. This is Simon Sinek, who everyone should follow.
Few of us can debate, right, that there's an increase in depression, anxiety, and suicide amongst young people. I mean, the statistics are alarming. The highest rate increase of suicide in the United States is girls 10 to 14 years old. The number of girls 10 to 14 years old, the number of suicides has tripled in the past 15 years, right? Girls also engage in social media 40% more than boys. It's not a causal relationship, but there's a correlation that's probably worth looking at. We know about bullying online. When I was a kid and I tripped over in the cafeteria, everybody laughed at me. I was really embarrassed. They'd make fun of me for a day or two, and then it was done. Now, somebody will film it, and it will last your entire school career. That has to affect somebody's self-confidence and sense of self. The idea where all of our validation now comes from the number of likes, the number of followers we have, has to have an impact on the way we conduct ourselves in the world and the way that we make friends. And many, many people will report that they will admit that though they may have fun with their friends, that they have many superficial friendships, that they don't actually rely on their friends if they're going for hard times. Like, we cannot get away from this. We cannot get away from the fact that more and more universities, many private schools now, not just private schools, many schools now for young people now have wellness programs and therapists for children, for like 10 years old and 14-year-olds, not because they think those kids are anything wrong with them, it's because the universities are inheriting 18 and 19-year-olds that are struggling with wellness and coping mechanisms so badly that they're actually starting to address the issues with the kids younger to teach them coping mechanisms before they get to college. We cannot ignore these things. And though there are many factors, like an excessive amount of finite-mindedness, like the excessive focus on short-term performance, like the lack of loyalty to employees in companies. You know, companies constantly complain that your generation doesn't offer any loyalty to the company. I don't blame you. Why should you? They give you none. They miss their annual numbers, and you're laid off. It's not a meritocracy, nothing personal, it's just business, right? Why should you give them loyalty if they give you nothing? So I think we cannot ignore these factors, of which one of them, of course, has to be the imbalance of social media and cell phones in our lives. I'm not against it. I'm against the amount of it, right? That we can't
I think I'm just going to let it play.
go for dinner with a friend and put our phone in airplane mode for an hour and a half and just be present with our friends. And so how do we combat this imbalance? We do more yoga. Like, you gotta be kidding me, right? Like, no amount of yoga will fix work-life imbalance.
I personally hate yoga, so I understand.
I mean, you know, and what we forgot, I mean, it's a very American thing that we've done, which is we've taken these wonderful Eastern philosophies like yoga and meditation, and we've actually made them selfish pursuits, right? I went to this big meeting once, it was a small meeting actually. I went to this small meeting once, and there was a person sitting next to me who was apparently a big-timey yoga instructor. The entire time we were in the meeting, she was on her cell phone under the table. And it wasn't like she had a family member in a hospital and she was checking in. I could see she was on social media, right? And at one point, the conversation went to, we were talking about being present. And she perked up, and she goes, "That's why I love yoga, it helps me be present," right? Being present doesn't mean you pay $35 and you feel good about yourself for 1 hour, right? That's not what being present means. You do not get to say when you're being present. You are present when somebody else says you are. And the reason we meditate, for example, is because we learn things like calm and quiet and focus. And when you meditate, you have a thought and you learn to label that thought and put it out of your head and deal with it later, so that when you're with a friend and they're talking, you're not thinking about your next thought. You put your thought aside and you listen entirely to what they're saying. You focus on one thing, which is them. And you are not present until your friend at the end of the conversation says to you, "Thank you for listening. I feel heard. Thank you for being present with me."
So I love Simon Sinek. He's a great speaker.
I love him too.
You know, another thing he had talked about was this idea of using social media to be vulnerable and to connect. And I think that's a trap.
It's 100% a trap. He talked about the rising rates of suicide amongst teen girls in particular. Boy suicides are up as well, as a matter of fact. I do have data on that. I don't have it like in my hand, but we could pull up the numbers. Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff wrote a book called The Coddling of the American Mind, which also talks about the same trend. And that thing about using social media to expose yourself to people, be vulnerable, and, connect, it's 100% a trap. All it does is it creates the vicious feedback loop that we're talking about, where if you don't get enough validation the first time around, you're going to go back for more. And then eventually you're going to get people that are going to bully you. And in a bad, like in the worst possible situation, right? The bullying gets so...
And it is such a dopamine thing. It's like, okay, so you post one photo and you get 100 likes. And it's like, oh God, that felt so good. So you post another photo. Oh, but it only gets 70 likes. and then you feel like shit about yourself or whatever. And it's like, how much do those really mean to you, instead of maybe the photo itself and how much joy you can actually get out of taking the photo or whatever.
Right.
But the point I was, he had mentioned the broadcasting versus intimacy. When you take a selfie or you are broadcasting on Instagram, that's not true vulnerability. It's one-sided. It's you and the mob, and you are getting some kind of validation, but you're just broadcasting. True intimacy and vulnerability is interpersonal. It's 1v1. You're listening, you're talking, it's a real more of an exchange. So just something to consider, but that totally, affects our health. Yes. But everything is related to politics. I love that he shouts out meditation as well, and kind of the true meaning of being present. And that's where, real quickly, if people want to try to understand, like, I'm trying to model my political expression after Marianne Williamson and Joe Rogan. If they had a baby, I want the open-mindedness of Joe Rogan, even sometimes to a fault. I have my own qualms about Joe Rogan and him and who he gives a platform to. But he's a good interviewer and a good listener. And then Marianne Williamson was kind of the kooky person on the debate stage, but she talks a lot about like the politics of love and is trying to kind of influence like more of a mindfulness thing. So I had to shout those people out. But back to the Simon Sinek clip there, this same paradigm that is operating on our dopamine and making us feel insecure and leading to suicide rates. And I'm, guilty as much as anyone. I use Instagram and Twitter and have the same rushes. That plays into the political discourse and arena as well. And even worse, because with politics, it's no longer a shallow thing. Ultimately is now becoming like a life or death type of argument. The Social Dilemma. Tom, have you seen that?
Yeah, I've seen that. I highly recommend everyone watch that.
That's another recommendation. So social media, where our brains are already kind of in this state, whether we realize it or not. This like phony vulnerability, but really it's just not real connection. And so then we have a place where we have like political debates in Twitter and Facebook. And honestly, sometimes I think, because I've certainly gotten into it and I like to express my opinion on Facebook when people are sharing stuff. Sometimes those conversations are so hard. They are hard, very hard to have face to face. So they end up coming out on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. Twitter has a character limit, so it's probably the worst place to have a political discussion, just because you're limited. You really can't have any kind of nuanced discourse. At least with Facebook, you have no character limit. But I think there can be useful. Like, I actually think there was a positive Facebook interaction I had the other day with some recent news in Tacoma, with some police misconduct and some unlawfulness in the streets. And there's actually a thread that I was kind of proud of. Like, people, first off, like, race was never brought up, which I thought was interesting, because like it wasn't a racial issue. It was just policing issue. But people were, I think in that incident, it's just so clear that everyone was in the wrong. And it just became everyone was in the wrong. The police officer, obviously, but the people as well who were there. And it kind of like reached, like, it kind of seemed like, I just kind of pointed out the facts, and it kind of seemed like people ultimately were like almost driven into making our point and winning. We just get caught up in the sports team battle. And again, it's not, I think it's just naturally wired in our brain. There's a tribalism.
Well, that's the social media effect, is it not? Because the mainstream media 30 years ago, it was their job to show up on television with an opinion. And they weren't going to know what the public thought about their opinion probably ever. But I mean, there might be a columnist in the paper the next day that makes some reference to the segment, right? Like I'm talking about like 1990, some CNN segment, brand new CNN segment, and some columnist makes some comment, and maybe that hurt the panelists' feelings or whatever. But they're not getting feedback from hundreds of thousands of people on social media, which every single journalist is getting that, right? Am I making sense here?
Yeah.
So then you multiply that across every average citizen. I'm going to stick to the theme. Like it is very much about, I want to represent my political position in a way that will make me get cheers from people, like minimize boos and get as many cheers as possible from the crowd that I think I'm supposed to get cheers from. And you and I talked about a friend yesterday that we think has fallen victim to this. And there's, I think, I would argue hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people across this country and probably across the world that have fallen victim to that. Like you're talking about this dynamic that on Facebook, it sounds like yesterday actually turned out pretty well for you guys that we're talking about this, but I would say that's rare.
It is.
More often than not, people are they're going to decide, like, am I on this side of the ideological battle or this side of the ideological battle? And we're going to team up and arm up and like wage war against each other. And like, everyone's going to pat each other on the back from either team. And then you won't necessarily make any progress, but people might feel like they did the right thing because they defended their position and didn't let the other team win.
Yeah. And it's getting harder and harder when one side is increasingly losing their minds. Like, and that's even me saying that is like, oh, you're just dunking. Like, well, I don't necessarily want to get to that right now, but there's no shared reality anymore. Because I know that, people on the right I've often heard, or whoever will say the same thing about the left. The left is losing their mind and they're just insane. And maybe we're both going insane in a way. But the cable television, especially like the Obama era and how Fox News covered Obama, I think now you see a lot of that online, and kind of like the left is like, well, they started it, so like we're just going to dunk on them all the time and we're going to call out every single hypocrisy. And for me, I'm certainly guilty of it. I think it's hard to resist that. It's hard to argue why wouldn't you call out hypocrisy when you see it. But I think over the last decade and last four years especially, we see that is just not a successful strategy. It doesn't actually change minds or make progress. It just makes the other side dig in even deeper. And we become more and more polarized. So it's like, this is not a win-lose. It's the game theory. It's like, feels like such a win versus lose situation, but really the real game is to keep playing, folks, because if one side loses, we actually all lose.
Well, that's I know you said you didn't want to necessarily get into it, but I mean, I think that's a great synopsis of our current situation in terms of, 75 million people who voted for Trump. But I think you and I tend to agree that you can't it's not effective to categorize all 75 million of those people as, deplorable or racist or, conspiracy theorist or whatever.
Well, then, yeah, the segue that I'm kind of getting to is like, it actually, yeah, there are 75 million people who voted for Trump, and obviously not all of them are QAnon cultists, but QAnon is a real phenomenon, and there's still not a lot known about it, but it certainly is a unique product of social media and online radicalization. This is like any polarization that we had from cable television is nothing compared to what the power of the internet and these social media platforms, not just Twitter, Facebook, but like QAnon and Parler or whatever, any thing on the internet. I mean, we saw it the same way with Islamic extremists being radicalized, or, you know, ISIS or whatever. Same formula, but it's happening. You know, it can happen to anyone, really. And so now we probably do have maybe 10 million QAnon people. And I'm not saying all of them are going to go violent, but there already have been violent, like, murders from QAnon, and it becomes a psychosis. I was reading, Vice has been releasing some very good videos trying to dive into QAnon. I was just watching one before I hopped on here. It's like 46 minutes, and I'll be sure to link that as well. It's kind of scary. And so it's hard. I mean, is that the section of the population like that's just lost? I can certainly have a conversation with my dad who voted for Trump or whatever, or your dad or whoever may have voted for Trump, but has retained some sensibility about it and was turned off by the Capitol violence or whatever. But there are plenty of people who voted for Trump just because they want their retirement to do well, and they think that Republicans affect the economy, but they aren't racist, and they don't subscribe to kookiness, and they don't even necessarily like Trump as a person, but for whatever reason, they've been a Republican their whole life.
Well, and I also think too, just to add to that point, and I want to tie it back to social media so that we stay on theme. We do also have to be careful about imposing the effect of social media and just assuming it on everyone, because that's another factor going on. Is all 330 million people in the United States and the extended to the world are not on social media. Sure. There's millions and millions of people, especially in the older demographic, that they don't have Twitter and Instagram and even Facebook. Like, there's plenty of even old people that still don't have Facebook. And so, like, when you talk about, like, there's old people maybe that they just vote for Republicans just because that's what they do. We might criticize that, but they're not doing it maliciously or because they've been fed a conspiracy theorist. They're just kind of doing it thoughtlessly. And the fact that social media is radicalizing a certain group of people poses a completely different problem than how we step out of social media and try to, engage people that aren't even there.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That made a connection in my brain again, where I wanted to go as far as this kind of progression of polarization and this whole new level because of the internet and social media. There are nefarious actors. And when I've been saying nefarious a lot, what a great word, but there's a difference between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation lacks intent. It is just simply, they didn't do the research. They saw this thing. They think it's good. We're going to share it because, this resonates with me. Disinformation has the intent to sow chaos, and they know it's false. They know it's provocative and false. Mostly they know it's false and share it anyways. And that, I think, is really the big difference between, like, the history of cable news being polarized. You didn't have foreign governments able to interject into a TV show or something, or have their own hosted broadcast television show, right? Now you have the internet, which, may not be the wild, wild west that, cyberheads from the 90s feel it is, but it's still way less regulated or anything than we have currently. And so you do have, that's how QAnon is a psychic operation. We don't know who Q is. It's all anonymous message boards, and this whole game theory to it is, watch this. Just if you do any research on the QAnon thing, it is quite literally like it's some kind of foreign or it's intentional. It is disinformation. It is a brainwashing of sorts. And that what's so appealing about conspiracy theories is there's always some kind of sliver of truth in there. And that's where people are like, no, but this is true. And so then they think everything else has to be true about it. And it's just...
There's also a thinking on conspiracy theories that it's people yearning for a sense of control when they don't feel like there's any control to be had. And so in a way, there's almost this perverse circular problem where the ecosystem has become very unstable, and a lot of people that might otherwise be reasonably intelligent feel like they're losing their mind. Like this happens to me, where I'm like, I'll like see a clip of someone talking for 2 minutes, and then I'll come to understand that like everyone is really mad about what that person said, and then I'm like, what? Whoa! Like I don't understand that. Like I feel like that was just a perfectly reasonable 2 minute speech. Like, am I just way outside of bounds here? Like, what's going on? So, sorry to give the individual piece there, but like my point is, I think conspiracy theories give people a semblance of like, I do understand the true reality of the world. And that's comforting. It's in the same way that religion is comforting. And I would cite some sources. Chloe Valdari is a good example of someone who's talked about the West has become secularized. And so religion used to serve as like the sense of deeper meaning for the majority of society, and that's gone away. And so now people are seeking that deeper meaning elsewhere. And so I think for many people, conspiracy theories.
Well, specifically the QAnon one, which is really the largest, like, it's a phenomenon. There's no joke when you say there's millions of people who are Q supporters and stuff. There is like this religious like aspect to it, that they're fighting the Satanists, who are eating babies, and Trump is this messiah figure. It's really quite bizarre. But that's a good explanation of how people start to buy into it and why they buy into it. It is about, why I need to have some kind of sense of control over my life, and I need to know how the world works. Because, I've mentioned a few times in different posts about conspiracy theory. Is it Occam's razor?
Occam's razor.
Yeah. So the idea that, the more assumptions that you have to make about a situation, probably the less likely it is to be accurate or true.
Yeah, I think specifically Occam's razor, I'm going to paraphrase here, but I think specifically it's the philosophical principle that in a situation where there are multiple explanations for a complex phenomenon, the simplest or most straightforward explanation is the most likely.
Yeah. And I think back to what I was saying, how we always want to point the finger at these big businesses and these politicians, like they are intentionally manipulating, and there is some of that, but ultimately, man, like there are rich and powerful people who are influencing the world in a variety of ways, especially like transnational big corporations influence government much more than the average citizen does. However, there are so many people who are just, first off, they're incompetent. So even if they have that intention, I think we've seen that with the last presidential administration, they are not competent enough to pull off a grand conspiracy that requires such a level of secrecy and intricacy and organization that you really everyone needs to just be smart as shit to pull something off like that.
It's actually an argument for why all this election fraud stuff, it falls on its face, because you're like, think about the massive web of connected spies and like cheaters and riggers that would have had to have coordinated all at the same time with no one whistleblowing to swing like six
different states that all have their own laws and courts and election officials.
Right.
And, dude, they went 1 in 66 in court, I think. And
right.
All the, just if it's like, how many people have to be in on the conspiracy for it to actually work? Like, it's just,
yeah.
It does.
Not to mention the Democrats
apart.
Like threw seats in the House, like that's like, okay, let's give back 10 seats in the House in order to get the presidency, right, who's going to be a moderate and not do anything.
We know that most people, as crazy as it seems online, most people, I believe in my heart of hearts, are reasonable. And I'll shout out Thomas Paine, founding father. I don't think he was ever elected to a position, but he wrote The Age of Reason, which is a phenomenal pamphlet. It's a short book. It's definitely influences my life and views on these things. But reason, people, like, just use reason. Where I was going to get with this is, first off, I wanted to make a point. I think the most dangerous and destructive thing that the previous administration did was the election fraud and mail-in ballot fraud criticisms and falsehoods. That has destroyed and been more destructive than any other single policy or decision or statement that he has made at all. The fact that he has propagated the mail-in ballot fraud bullshit is the most destructive thing that he's done. So, kind of wrapping it up, we're at 50 minutes here. We're moving towards a conclusion, not that we're going to solve social media, but how do we regulate? It ultimately comes down to free speech versus propaganda or disinformation. That's kind of the crux of how we're going to fix social media discourse and this. We're going to have to, do we trust the machines? Are there algorithms and machine learning that are going to be able to spot, mis or disinformation? We've already kind of seen that with Facebook and Twitter starting to censor stuff. There's fact checked. They're trying to, they obviously banned Trump from Twitter. I heard that a bunch of Antifa accounts were also banned recently on Twitter. I know that you kind of have an opinion a little bit, and you'd even shared, maybe I should share this. It's probably a good time to share that clip you emailed me as far as, okay. Is it working?
Yep.
Do you want to break this down?
Yeah. So I guess, this is where now it's going to seem like I'm a conspiracy theorist, but this is just, to me, like kind of bread and butter. It's weird. I mean,
where'd you grab these screenshots?
So this was on Twitter, like several different people, not like wackos, like reasonable, like what seemed like reasonable blue check people that I've paid attention to before, that I follow. And it's just odd. Like, if this is real, it's like, what is YouTube doing? So, what it's showing is that in a span of 4 hours, it seems as if YouTube, or somehow this video has been like either doctored or recreated. Like they recreated a copy of it to get rid of the negative views.
Normally I don't trust like this kind of screenshot, right? It could be so easily photoshopped.
Right.
So we don't know that for sure, but that's the idea of what was trending, is that YouTube, and I think we do know that like YouTube and Twitter and Facebook do mess with the algorithms for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And we do know that they check, at least on Twitter followers, the number of real versus like just bots as well. So, I mean, there's a couple of things when I see this, is like the 10,000 could be just like a bot or an AI or something just trying to downvote the shit out of it. And so that's why YouTube had to make this correction, but it is weird.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And so like whether or not like this specific example, there could easily be a plausible explanation, right? I'm not trying to say like, oh, this is proof positive that like some major problem exists.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Like you need to defend this. This is
it's just, so I appreciate you kind of like, we can both level set. Like, it's weird. Right. And so it's more about broaching the topic and having a discussion about like, hey, whether or not there's a legitimate explanation in this particular case, we know that YouTube can do things like this. Like if YouTube chose to, it can take a video down. If YouTube chose to, it can swing the number of upvotes and downvotes on a video. right? It can recopy a video, like it can do different things.
Right.
So there are implications to our discourse for that. And then the second one is to me, this is kind of more instructive of like Twitter's foundational premise is supposed to be like this open forum, right? The, marketplace of ideas, or like public square. And so there was this big trend the other day because people have concerns that the recent Biden legislation or executive order, which dictates that transgender females would need to be allowed on biological female sports teams, has imposed a potential barrier for women in sports. And so I don't necessarily love the fact that Twitter is, in the case of just a hashtag, it's not even a news story that can be provably shown to be false. It's just a hashtag and a discussion. And Twitter is taking a stand, or Twitter
deleted this trending hashtag.
No, so Twitter was basically with this hashtag, it was associating its own commentary with the hashtag to somehow like offer its own take on the hashtag. And that's, to me, I don't necessarily love that, because it's like a hashtag is supposed to be like a public square discussion, and Twitter is like the overlord. So it's like, I don't think the overlord should be chiming in on a public square discussion. Again, I think there's a different argument if it's like, here's a demonstrably false Russian bot fake story versus Twitter trying to insert itself into the narrative in a public square discussion.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think those are both good examples of like, it isn't even the government having or really doing anything. I mean, I'm sure they are influencing these companies, but it is almost like we're almost living in like an Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged world, where the tech giant billionaires are the like chosen people to make these huge decisions, and they're bigger than government. And this free speech versus dis or misinformation, or just plain or like propaganda, is coming down to them. And we can only hope that they can be consistent, and that we, the people, can get a government that is representative of us. And so then therefore we're a little bit more, we stand more of a fight, I think, if we can get representatives who aren't corrupt, who represent the average citizen, and can therefore make a better argument and legislation that can influence these tech giants. Because it's for better or worse, we're basically leaving the fate of it up to like 3 people ultimately. It's pretty crazy.
Which is scary, and it's a discussion that we need to have.
Yeah. So we're at the hour, and I think that went pretty good. We'll see. Like, subscribe. I will say that I'm trying to work on the domain of Average Citizen, avgcitizen.com. Just go straight to the URL, because if you type in Average Citizen in Google, like, oh my God, everyone's going to do it now. But it's like some like weird, like men's provocative clothing thing. I don't know. It's fucking weird. I got to fix the SEO on my blog. So please just go to avgcitizen.com. And also, obviously, the Chatter Network is this podcast collective for now that Excuse the Intermission, Redux. We've got a couple other ones in the works that are going to be coming out there as well. So you follow the Chatter Network on social media, and check out those other podcasts and check us out. But as far as what we can do about social media, man, the power is still in your hands and in your brain, and you can unplug at any time. I will say I went 10 days without my phone, and it was by far the most shocking thing after those 10 days to come back to. I couldn't talk, a limited diet, I was meditating, and the single thing that was shocking to me was how addicting the phone was, and just how we gotta evolve and figure out a balance with it. And I think we are. I remain pretty hopeful. I'm hoping that we kind of are maybe hitting the rails as a society in a way before we spill over the rails. We're definitely hitting the rails. And so, hey, just keep being aware, be mindful. Hopefully that was fun to listen to. Any thoughts to close this out, Tom?
This was fun. Good first session. I hope we get some likes and some people are interested in what we have to say. And I hope we can continue to do this and provide people with a good example of how to have a good, healthy, productive conversation.
Amen. All right. Good night and good luck. Peace.